Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. On January the 15th, China Military Online announced the names of 16 senior People's Liberation Army officers who are under investigation for seriously violating party discipline, a euphemism for accusations of graft. The list includes 1 general, 4 lieutenant generals, 9 major generals, and 1 senior colonel. Is the corruption becoming the Chinese military's #1 enemy? How far will China's leadership push the anti-graft campaign in the military? And how should we interpret President Xi Jinping's vision for governing the country? To answer these questions, we are happy to be joined in the studio by Victor Gao, Director of the China National Association of International Studies, and Mr. Edward Lehman, Managing Director of Lehman, Lee and Xu. But before we start the interview, let's take a quick look at this.
China's military authorities recently took the rare step of releasing, on their official website, a list of 16 senior military officials who were put under investigation for graft in the past year. All but 1 senior colonel of the 16 military officials on the list are PLA commanders at the major general level or above. Lu Jing, who is among the names revealed for the first time on the list, is not the first deputy head of the PLA's General Logistics Department to be in the firing line. His predecessor, Gu Jinshan, was charged with embezzlement, bribery, misuse of state funds and abuse of power in early 2012. While logistics posts are some of the most susceptible to corruption, other areas that will be probed include project construction, personnel and finance, management and materials and armament procurement. Among the names previously published is Xu Taiho, the former vice chairman of the Central Military Commission. Xu was expelled from the CPC last June and is under investigation for allegedly taking bribes. He is the most senior military officer to face charges of this nature in more than 30 years. The release of the graft list came on the heels of a 3-day plenary session of the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection of the Communist Party of China, during which President and Party General Secretary Xi Jinping said there will be no let-up in the battle against corruption. The growing focus on investigating PLA leadership echoes military leaders' increasing concerns that corruption has the potential to undermine the military preparedness of China's 2.3 million strong armed forces. The past year also marked the 120th anniversary of the First Sino-Japanese War, known in China as the War of Jiawu, in which the Chinese Navy was defeated. Liu Yazhou, the political commissioner of China's National Defense University, warns that 120 years on, as corruption and a new type of rigidity again erode the country and the military, we are unable to say farewell to the War of Jiawu. Actually, we may disturbingly find ourselves under the shadow of that war.
Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. East Asia sees the fastest growth in military spending in recent years, and the alleged assertiveness of China has become a major concern for neighboring countries, and particularly for the U.S., which has long been the dominant force in maintaining the security architecture in East Asia. However, many Chinese would argue, who is the most formidable enemy of China in the post-Cold War era? Victor, what's your take?
Well, I would say if you look around at the world today, there are threats to China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And you talked about the military budget. However, on a per capita basis, and also in light of the size of China, the population of China, and the fact that China is the #1 trading nation in the world with economic and trading interests throughout the world, the military budget for China as a whole is actually not that large, especially compared with that of the United States. So I think neighboring countries should not be alarmed by the Chinese military spending. I think fundamentally the Chinese military strategy is still on defense and also promoting peace and stability throughout the world.
Lehman, do you buy his idea of being self-deprecating, considering the sizable stakes of China throughout the whole world?
Well, I think that the world has changed dramatically in as much as who is the enemy, who's the enemy has changed. I mean, is it terrorism? Is it, there are all sorts of things, cyber warfare. I think that a modern modern military, it isn't so much necessarily about the size of the military, but it's a question of using it efficiently and effectively. And I think that that's what's most important. So I think that the world continues to change, and we've seen with Edward Snowden, we've seen with the hacks to the military information on the internet in the United States. So the enemy is something different than it was 40 or 50 years ago, and as a result, the expenditures and the utility has to go into looking at that new enemy.
I'm arguing, gentlemen, whether the biggest threat comes from within. In both the case of the U.S. and in China in particular, let's look at the issue of corruption. Why, all of a sudden, we had a shocking news of a disgraceful fall of up to 16 generals from the PLA. Not a single campaign, starting from the anti-Japanese war to the 3-year civil strife, have we had so many generals within the military of the PLA to be defeated. Now, they have become the victim of the problem of rampant corruption. Why do we have this rampant problem, Victor?
Well, I would say since the end of the 1990s, corruption in China has become very, very rampant and almost deeply entrenched. And it permeates throughout all walks of life in China, not only within the party, within the government, with the state-owned enterprises, etc. And the military, unfortunately, is not an exception. And although I would say that corruption in any place, in any form, in any color and shape is a dangerous thing, military in the corruption, especially involving bribing one's way into high senior military positions, is especially dangerous. And I would say that while the news is shocking, it's not the end of the story. I would say that in the coming months or a couple of years, there will be more revelations about corruption among the top brass of the military. And this campaign against military corruption involving senior military officers will not be exhausted for quite some time, and we will expect to have more revelation about bigger scandals in the military. So I would say that for the Chinese nation and for the rest of the world, we need to be prepared. President Xi Jinping and the party leadership under his control will leave no stone unturned in the military in terms of identifying corruption and fighting against those officials in the military who have committed corruption. Corruption in the military is not only against military rules, it's also against party rules, and also it's in violation of the laws of the People's Republic of China.
But we don't have a sense of security if the rampant problem of corruption sweeps the whole barracks. Now, what we call transformation from the closed economy to a modernized market economic orientation in the second decade of the 21st century could be called the growth of burgeoning awareness about rule of law. Since people didn't have the basic idea about following the law and what consequences could they have if they choose to ignore complying with the law, then what do you think of the army? Don't you think this problem has also been ignored by those within the barracks, and therefore they violated the discipline and the law without realizing the consequences?
You know, I certainly think so. First of all, most Army personnel are not trained in the law. They're not thinking in a legal mind. And even with the evolution over the last 87 years of the People's Liberation Army, it comes from a rule of man. I mean, the commander makes the rules, and they're listening. The average rank and file is listening to the commanders. What you have now is, even though, as Victor Gao pointed out, the budget per capita might not be large compared to other countries on the military budget, but it is billions and billions of dollars. They oversee oil and sanitation and purchasing of building new barracks and construction of all kinds. And with that amount of money, there is a huge temptation to be able to misuse that money and going largely unchecked. So I think you're exactly right. They're not educated in the law. They're not used to following the rule of law as Army personnel, and they've been sort of unchecked to a large extent, and as a result, being unchecked allows them corruption to happen. And so I think this is a very opportune time for this to happen.
The two militaries of the U.S. and China have both argued for a long time about the issue of transparency. Now, this time around, corruption has become a part of the issue, right? Victor, Western critics have long argued that the role of media acting as a watchdog to supervise the misconduct of government officials is called into question given the unique political institutions of this country. Therefore, barracks of the military do not share the sunshine of media supervision. Is that one of the major reasons behind the rise of corruption?
Well, I would say, on the one hand, media in China is playing increasingly important role in supervision of corruption of all forms in China. But military is a little bit more difficult, mainly because military as it is, and not only in China, but probably in many other parts of the world, have its own way of military training, promotions, hiring and firing.
But they also have their own courts and procurators.
Exactly.
Sure.
But I would say the root cause of corruption in the Chinese military trace back to the late 1990s. And as it turned out, among the top brass of the military, you have very, very senior three-star generals who have been identified with huge amount of corruption. And if they are the leading officers of the whole military, millions of soldiers and officers, they set the bad example. I think this pollutes the whole system in the military, and lower ranks of the military officers will look up to the senior commanding officers as role models, and eventually they pick up these corrupt practices and they take it for granted as if that's the legitimate way of promoting themselves, getting themselves into higher officers of importance. So I would say President Xi Jinping and his associates have done China and the Chinese military a big, big favor of turning the tide around, of setting the good example, and really penalizing those very, very senior commanding officers in the Chinese military. Now, the recent actions against these senior officers are unprecedented in the Chinese military, as you pointed out, especially, since the reform and economic reform and the political reform and opening to the outside world starting at the late 1970s.
No, but it also, just to follow on that, if you're trading money for ranks, then you're going to have senior military officers who are incompetent, that are just able to buy their rank, or lesser military officers. So it weakens. This is why this is so opportune and such a good time now.
Yes, President Xi Jinping is doing a good job at the right time. He deserves credit for the sweeping anti-graft campaign, even within the military. However, what we're discussing here reminds me of a movie portraying the border clash between Vietnam and China in 1979. And Jimmy Carter, your former president, knew this. Deng Xiaoping visited the U.S. and they discussed how to punish the Vietnamese for the invasion of Cambodia. Now, that's put aside. The protagonist of the movie tells a lot about how to undergo a house cleaning campaign within the military. Now, a lot of the children from the generation of veteran revolutionaries who joined the army during the Cultural Revolution refused to go to the forefront of the army. Now, my point, which is very controversial for the next question, is whether having a war is the best way for cleaning your house. Because in the U.S. you have one after another regional conflict, and you were very confident to win two regional low-intensity conflicts.
Right.
The theory actually kicked off in the years of Ronald Reagan, with Carsten Weinberger, the former Secretary of Defense, putting forward this idea on the table. So the question is whether the Chinese military have long lived in peace times, and they need to have a conflict, a war, to rid the army of corruption. Now, this is a radical shock therapy, right?
Well, while I can see where you come from, I strongly disagree with the underlying theory. Mainly because I hope, China and all the other countries in the world will live in a world without war and with peace prevailing throughout all parts of the world. Now, the problems in the Chinese military have many reasons, and the fact that the Chinese military has not been involved in any war, for example, as you correctly pointed out, for almost 30 years, is one reason why the military probably has picked up a lot of complacency, and they pick up lots of other things which are not directly related to war preparedness. So in a sense, I agree with you that the Chinese military need to exercise very, very diligently to prepare for the war, but China need to stand on a higher plateau to prevent
Victor,
any outbreak of war.
Victor, the essence of your comments is actually about the peaceful rise of China, which will not endanger the existing international economic political order. However, other than the fanfare of media rhetoric about peaceful rise, what do you think of the role and the function of the military-industrial complex in the United States? Even with the demise of the Soviet Union, the American, the NATO have always been looking for a new enemy, so that their machinery could be, their huge military machinery could be kept alive, so that the military budget could be guaranteed in the congressional budgetary hearings. So do you think that in this area China has a lot to learn from the U.S.?
Well, yeah, I mean, well, the one thing the U.S. does well, like you said, like you identified, is we always have a so-called enemy, whatever that enemy is, and that's usually propped up by politicians. It's usually propped up by people who can profit from the military machine. So large multinational companies that facilitate the American military, and so. I do believe, though, China is confronting not a war like we would say a war like we had many, many years ago, but there are wars on, like I said, terrorism. There are things that we have to be vigilant and watchful for all the time, the Chinese nation should be. And so in essence, we are preparing for a different kind of war and a different kind of conflict, which China should answer to.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I have to leave you there for the moment. You are watching Dialogue with Victor Gao, Director of the China National Association of International Studies, and Edward Lehman, Managing Director of Lehman, Lee and Xu. We've been discussing the issue of corruption for the military. Up to 16 generals have been singled out in this anti-graft campaign. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back, gentlemen. Now, in the wake of the Cultural Revolution, Mr. Deng Xiaoping, our late paramount leader, asked up to 1 million military personnel to be moved from barracks. They returned to the civilian departments. Now, in this way, Victor, how could the sufficient military budget be guaranteed? And without the sufficient military budget, how could the military, maintain their normal life? We know from the case of the U.S., Robert Gates and Chuck Hagel both retired, and they left the Pentagon out of great anger. For at least one reason, Susan Rice has been, on loggerheads with the two top brass. Now, back in China, it's also about how to look at the relationship between the civilian department and the military, because it has a lot to do with the budget, Victor.
Well, China, under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, around the time of 1984-1985, made a major decision of reducing the size of the Chinese military by 1 million. I was in the government at that time. I was an interpreter for Deng Xiaoping, and I was personally privy to that whole process. I think that decision was a very, very correct one, based on Deng Xiaoping's judgment that another new world war would not break out anytime soon, and China need to devote the scarce resources on economic and civilian development rather than building up all the military. Now, eventually, I think China probably had squeezed the military budget too much, and the military for many years, after that major reduction of 1 million soldiers from the military, had a very, very small budget, and they had to actually engage in businesses.
Coming back to examine what's happened in the U.S. Between the White House and the Pentagon, Robert Gates and Chuck Hagel both resigned. At least one major reason has been the major cuts of the military budget. Those guys, Robert Gates and Chuck Hagel, seriously disagree. But they have the exit strategy. They have the exit mechanism. They can resign and retire.
Right.
But in China, I mean, again, do you think this is a hotbed for corruption, for breeding corruption in the Chinese military? We don't have a healthy exit mechanism for the senior generals to resign, and therefore they have to live on the salaries, where the salaries in theory remain pretty low since the end of the Cultural Revolution.
Right. I mean, and again, there's a few things that would be different. One is there's not a system of checks and balances, although, I mean, military budgets and military information is that of national concern and national safety, and so there's a balance there between sharing that information with the general public and keeping it secret to keep the country safe. What I think we have in the United States is that there is congressional overview on spending. There is congressional overview, and some of that is kept secret, and some of it, but it's shared among senators. We don't necessarily have that here. And even with Chuck Hagel and them, their position was not in the military per se, but they were head of different departments. They weren't actual military officers. They had been in the past, but not at this point in time. So you're right. I think that the differences are great, and I think the checks and balances would be beneficial here in China. That it shouldn't just be the military policing the military. There should be other ways of looking at this.
Let's look at another interesting issue. 2 years after Xi Jinping took office, his book was published on governance of China. Now, that's unprecedented. That's really a big wow for the rest of the world. In this book, he talked a lot about military build-up. In fact, unlike his predecessors, he quickly visited almost all the major military regions, the Navy, our Second Artillery, and the Air Force, so to speak. He's really a hands-on style, and that means he pays an awful lot of attention to military build-up in the wake of the Gulf War that inspired, Mr. Jiang Zemin, former chairman of the Central Military Commission of the PRC, of the CPC. Now, do you think Mr. Xi is very serious about winning the war, despite our allegation for pursuing peaceful rise?
Well, as a matter of fact, President Xi Jinping's first job out of college was to serve as the personal assistant to the then General Gambiao, who was at that time the Secretary General of the Central Military Commission. And Mr. Xi served in that position for 3 years. So that
way about going about it. The problem with it is again, it was Victor Gao had pointed out, is that it's not necessarily under the civil law. I mean, the judges and civilians can't do it. It's under the military law. But now he's reached out and looked into the military, which is a new perspective.
Now, do you think Mr. Xi Jinping has reached the point of no return given the rise of social media, because the social media is able to exercise absolute supervision against corruption inside and outside the barracks?
Well, I would say now we have the benefit of hindsight, and we realized how serious corruption in all walks of life in China has become. I would say it does not take a rocket scientist to figure out that if corruption in China, in the civilian side as well as in the military side of the equation, remain taken care of, China will collapse as a country, and the ruling party will collapse, and the Chinese military will fail whenever they may be engaged in a real war. So I think the sense of urgency is there, and I think we are very grateful that President Xi Jinping is really exercising his leadership, taking bold, audacious steps in weeding out corruption in all colors and forms and shapes, not only in the military but also in the party and the civilian side of the equation. And I think we can no longer afford to leave this task half finished. We have reached the point of no return. We have to push forward until China will be a new China, where corruption will not be tolerated, and it will rise up to the level of self-consciousness of the party officers, government officers, and military officers, that if they commit corruption, their hands will be caught and they will bring down their own fall.
Given the enormous approval rating that Mr. Xi Jinping enjoys at this defining moment of China's social development, I believe it's not just a matter of having a sense of urgency, but it's a matter of a mandate in his hands.
You're right.
Thank you very much for your time and participation. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.